On October 27, 1986, 15 toddlers vanished from the Little Sprouts Daycare in Meadow Creek, Oregon. One moment, they were playing, their laughter echoing through the small building. The next, there was only silence. For 33 years, their disappearance was a gaping wound in the heart of the community, a cold case wrapped in whispered theories of kidnapping and tragedy. The parents grew old, forever haunted by the ghosts of children who never came home. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer that never came. For 33 years, the mystery was absolute. A perfect crime or a perfect tragedy. No one knew which. Until the year 2019, when a construction crew, tasked with demolishing the derelict daycare, made a chilling discovery buried deep beneath the foundation. A discovery that would not only solve the mystery of the lost Sprouts, but would also reveal a truth more monstrous and heartbreaking than anyone had ever dared to imagine. What they found would prove that the children had never left the property at all. Before the silence there was life, vibrant and full of promise. At the center of one of those lives was Leo Hayes, a 3-year-old with a mop of unruly blonde hair and a smile that could disarm a thundercloud. Leo was a whirlwind of joyous energy. He loved dinosaurs, the color red, and the specific, worn-out corner of his blue blanket he'd rub against his cheek to fall asleep. His world was small and safe, defined by the loving orbit of his parents, Sarah and David Hayes. Sarah was a freelance graphic designer who worked from a sunlit room in their modest home, her schedule built around Leo's naps and playtime. David was a high school history teacher, a man who saw the grand sweep of time, but whose entire universe had collapsed into the bright, curious eyes of his son. Their life in Meadow Creek was idyllic, almost cliché. It was a town of picket fences and Saturday morning farmers markets, where neighbors knew each other by name, and kids could play outside until dusk. The Hayes family embodied this dream. Their evenings were filled with storybooks and bath time, their weekends with trips to the park and clumsy attempts at baking cookies that always ended with more flour on Leo than in the bowl. David was building a treehouse in their backyard, a project he'd promised Leo would be ready by his 4th birthday. It was a symbol of their future, a future they mapped out in nightly conversations after Leo was asleep. School plays, little league games, scraped knees, first heartbreaks, graduation. They had so much to live for because Leo had so much to live for. He was not just a child. He was the repository of all their hopes, the living, breathing manifestation of their love. He had a particular way of saying, "I love you," stretching out the "you" into a long, happy sound. "I love you." It was the soundtrack of their home, the note around which their entire lives were composed. The loss of that sound would be the loss of everything. The morning of October 27, 1986, dawned crisp and clear, the autumn air sharp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. It was a Monday, and the routine was comfortingly familiar. Sarah wrestled a wriggling Leo into his favorite red overalls, the metallic clasps cool against her fingers. He was excited for daycare, chattering about his best friend, Maya, and the finger paints they were supposed to use that day. David kissed them both goodbye at the door, ruffling Leo's hair and reminding him to be a good little dinosaur. The drive to Little Sprouts was short, the streets of Meadow Creek quiet. Sarah noticed nothing out of the ordinary, at least not consciously. Later, under the harsh lights of an interrogation room, she would torture herself over the details she'd missed. The daycare owner, Agnes Reed, a stout woman in her late 50s who was usually a pillar of calm, seemed flustered, her smile tight and her eyes darting nervously. Sarah attributed it to a busy morning. She also saw a man she didn't recognize, a burly figure in dirty work clothes, hauling bags of what looked like concrete mix from a truck parked near the back of the building. Agnes had simply waved it off, saying, "Just some overdue repairs on the patio." Sarah accepted the explanation without a second thought. She knelt to give Leo one last hug. He clung to her for a moment longer than usual, burying his face in her coat. "I love you, Mommy," he'd said, his voice slightly muffled. She'd kissed the top of his head, breathing in the sweet scent of his shampoo. "I love you too, my sweet boy. Be good for Mrs. Reed." She watched him run inside, his little red overalls a bright splash of color against the pale yellow walls of the daycare. He turned and gave her one final wave before disappearing into the playroom. That wave, that flash of red, would be seared into her memory forever. It was a seemingly insignificant morning, one of thousands. But every mundane detail, the hurried goodbye, the unfamiliar handyman, Agnes's strained expression, was a breadcrumb leading toward an unimaginable abyss. It was the last time any parent would see their child alive. The day passed as all days do. Parents worked, ran errands, and anticipated the sweet reunion at the end of the afternoon. At 5 p.m., the familiar rhythm of pickup time began. Cars started pulling into the small lot in front of Little Sprouts Daycare, but something was wrong. The building was dark. The cheerful, hand-painted welcome sign on the door seemed to mock the eerie silence. A father, Mark Chen, was the first to arrive to pick up his daughter, Lily. He tried the door, locked. He peered through the windows, but the blinds were drawn. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Soon, other parents arrived. David Hayes pulled up at 5:15, a small toy dinosaur on the passenger seat as a surprise for Leo. He saw the cluster of confused parents and his heart began to pound. Confusion curdled into dread. Where were the children? Where was Agnes? Panic began to ripple through the small crowd. They started calling out their children's names, the sound swallowed by the unnerving quiet. One mother noticed an overturned sippy cup on the porch, a small puddle of milk already attracting ants. It was a tiny domestic detail that was utterly terrifying in its context. The scene was wrong. Daycares weren't supposed to be silent and locked at 5:15 p.m. They were supposed to be chaotic symphonies of laughter, crying, and the relieved chatter of parents. This was a void. David Hayes, his voice trembling, was the one who finally made the call. The 911 dispatcher's recording captured the raw, escalating terror. "My son, all the kids, they're gone," David stammered. "The daycare is empty. It's locked. Oh God, they're all gone." Within minutes, the first police cruiser arrived, its flashing lights painting the horrified faces of the parents in strobing blues and reds. The officer forced the door open. The interior was pristine, unnervingly so. Toys were neatly put away in their bins. Tiny jackets hung on their designated hooks. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no ransacked rooms. It was as if the 15 toddlers and their caretaker had simply been erased from existence. The disappearance of 15 children triggered one of the largest and most desperate search operations in Oregon's history. State police, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers descended on Meadow Creek, turning the small town into a sprawling command center. The initial theory, the one that seemed most plausible, was a mass kidnapping. The FBI focused on this, investigating potential ransom motives, disgruntled parents, or cult activity. They questioned a frantic and seemingly devastated Agnes Reed, who provided the investigation with its first, and ultimately fatal, piece of misdirection. She told a harrowing story of seeing a large, windowless white van parked down the street earlier that day, claiming she'd felt uneasy about it. This single fabricated detail sent law enforcement on a nationwide hunt for a phantom vehicle, a wild goose chase that would consume precious time and resources for years. The search of the immediate area was almost immediately crippled by an act of nature. That very night, a brutal, unseasonal storm swept through the region. Torrential rains lashed down for 2 straight days, turning the surrounding forests and fields into a quagmire of mud. Any potential tracks, scents for search dogs, or dropped items were washed away, erased by the deluge. The storm felt like a cruel accomplice to whatever had happened. The search teams were tireless, but they were looking in the wrong places for the wrong thing. They scoured a 20-mile radius, helicopters buzzing overhead until one tragically crashed in the difficult terrain, killing 2 members of the search party and casting a pall of tragedy over an already desperate effort. For the families, the experience was an exercise in pure agony. They were shuffled between briefings that offered no new information, their hope eroding with each passing day. The sheer scale of the victim count, 15 children, paralyzed the small community and overwhelmed the investigators. How could 15 toddlers vanish without a single witness, without a single cry being heard? The parents' frustration mounted, turning to anger at the perceived incompetence of the search. They felt the investigation was focused on a Hollywood-style kidnapping plot, while the real answers were slipping away. They were right. The search failed not because of a lack of effort, but because it was built on a foundation of lies. They were searching the forests, the highways, and the entire country, but the truth was just feet away, buried under the very spot where they'd last seen their children. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months, and then, inexorably, into years. The investigation into the disappearance of the lost Sprouts, as the media had grimly christened them, went cold. The national news crews packed up and left, leaving Meadow Creek to contend with its raw, unhealing wound. The case became a piece of dark American folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by parents in other towns. For the families, life became a frozen landscape of grief. Anniversaries were marked by vigils where parents held faded photographs of toddlers who would now, in theory, be teenagers, then college students, then adults. Some couples divorced under the immense strain. Others, like Sarah and David Hayes, clung to each other, their shared sorrow the only thing holding their shattered world together. David never finished the treehouse. Its skeletal frame stood in their backyard for years, a monument to a future that had been stolen. The Little Sprouts Daycare building was abandoned, legally entangled and emotionally radioactive. It became a grim landmark. Teenagers dared each other to touch its decaying walls, telling ghost stories about the lost children. The property was overgrown with weeds, the cheerful yellow paint peeling to reveal rotting wood beneath. It was a physical manifestation of the town's own decay, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the mystery at its heart. The feeling of hopelessness was a permanent resident in Meadow Creek. There were no bodies, no ransom notes, no answers, just a vast, silent emptiness. The absence of closure was a unique form of torture. Without a grave to visit or a killer to hate, the families were suspended in a state of limbo, unable to mourn and unable to move on. The ripple effects were profound. The town's idyllic reputation was shattered, replaced by one of tragedy and suspicion. People looked at their neighbors differently. The trust that had once defined the community was gone, replaced by the gnawing question of what evil could have taken place on that ordinary Monday, and who might have seen something, anything, and stayed silent. For 33 years, that silence held. The case files gathered dust, the parents' hair turned gray, and a new generation was born in Meadow Creek who knew the story of the lost Sprouts only as a local legend. Then, in the summer of 2019, the gears of fate began to turn, set in motion by something as mundane as a property sale. The derelict daycare lot, a blight on the town for over 3 decades, was finally purchased by a commercial developer with plans to build a modern retail complex. The sale was a quiet relief for many, a chance to finally tear down the monument to their collective trauma and build something new. In August, the demolition crew arrived. The old wooden structure was torn down in a single day, leaving nothing but the concrete slab foundation. The next phase was excavation for the new building's deeper, modern foundation. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, a heavy-duty excavator clawed at the earth, digging deep into the ground beneath where the old playroom once stood. The operator, a man named Frank, was half listening to the radio, going through the motions, when the machine's massive steel bucket struck something. It wasn't the familiar jarring crunch of rock or the dull thud of a buried pipe. This was a hard, hollow, and profoundly unnatural impact. He stopped the machine and got out, peering into the hole. He saw the edge of something concrete, but it wasn't the old foundation. It was something else, something deeper. It looked like a secondary, crudely poured slab buried several feet down. A strange, cold feeling washed over him. He called his foreman over. Following protocol for any unexpected find, they stopped all work and called the county sheriff's office, assuming they'd hit an old septic tank or some forgotten utility line. They had no idea that this single, accidental strike from an excavator bucket had just shattered 3 decades of silence and reopened one of the most heartbreaking cold cases in American history. They had just found the lid to a tomb. The construction site was immediately cordoned off, transformed overnight from a place of future commerce to a place of past horror. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, sealing off the property that had held its secret for so long. The discovery of the anomalous concrete slab, buried deep beneath the original, was a red flag of the highest order. Forensic archaeologists were brought in, a team more accustomed to unearthing ancient history than the recent past. They worked with painstaking precision, drilling through the mysterious lower slab. The moment the drill broke through, a faint, musty odor, the smell of earth and profound decay, seeped out. What they found next confirmed everyone's worst fears. Using endoscopic cameras, they peered into the void beneath the concrete. In the darkness, illuminated by the tiny light, were the unmistakable shapes of small bones. The site was declared a mass grave. The excavation that followed was a slow, sacred, and horrifying process. Under the stunned gaze of investigators and the glare of news cameras held at a distance, the team carefully unearthed the remains of 15 small children. They were found clustered together in what appeared to be the remnants of an old, collapsed shaft. The town of Meadow Creek and the surviving families were plunged into a new state of shock and grief. The mystery of where the children were was solved. But a more monstrous question now emerged. How did they get there, and who put them there? The investigation, now a homicide case, was reignited with a terrifying new focus. They weren't looking for a kidnapper. They were looking for a killer who had walked free for 33 years. The key was the concrete. Geologists and material scientists analyzed samples from both the original Daycare slab and the hidden one below. The results were the bombshell that cracked the case wide open. The original, visible slab was poured in 1985 when the Daycare was built. But the deeper, hidden slab, the one sealing the tomb, was made of a different concrete mix, one that was chemically dated to late 1986. It had been poured after the children disappeared. The focus immediately snapped to the one person who controlled the property, the owner, Agnes Reed. Now in her early 90s and living in a retirement home, she was a frail, forgetful old woman. But investigators also discovered a crucial piece of her family history. Her brother, who had died of a heart attack in 1987, had owned a small concrete contracting business. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place with horrifying speed. Detectives tracked down the handyman Sarah Hayes had briefly seen on that final morning. He was an old man now, living in another state, consumed by a lifetime of guilt. Under the pressure of a new relentless interrogation, his carefully constructed wall of silence finally crumbled. He confessed, his voice choked with tears. He told them the truth. The Daycare had been built over the improperly sealed shaft of an abandoned exploratory mine. Agnes Reed knew about it. She had cut corners to save money. On October 27, 1986, the floor of the playroom, weakened by rot and poor support, had collapsed. The children had fallen into the darkness of the shaft below. Some were likely killed in the fall, others injured and trapped. In a moment of pure sociopathic panic, facing financial ruin, lawsuits, and prison for her criminal negligence, Agnes had made a monstrous choice. She didn't call 911. She called her brother. That night, under the cover of darkness and the brewing storm, while the town began its frantic search, Agnes, her brother, and the terrified handyman silenced the shaft forever. They poured tons of concrete into the opening, entombing the children, some of whom may have still been alive. They worked all night to pour a new slab over it, and Agnes invented the story of the white van, a lie that would protect her for the next 3 decades. The final confrontation with Agnes Reed was chilling. She sat in her wheelchair, a blanket over her knees, denying everything with a vacant stare. But when presented with the core sample analysis, the handyman's confession, and the blueprints of her brother's concrete work, her facade shattered. There was no confession, only a cold, dead silence. The truth was finally out, and it was a truth born from greed, cowardice, and an evil beyond all comprehension. The revelation sent a shockwave of horror through the entire country. The story of the lost sprouts was no longer a mystery. It was one of the most depraved cover-ups imaginable. Agnes Reed, despite her age and frailty, was arrested and charged with 15 counts of felony murder. The news media descended upon Meadow Creek once again, but this time they told a story not of disappearance, but of grotesque betrayal. The why was laid bare for the world to see, a sickening calculus of self-preservation. Agnes Reed was on the verge of bankruptcy. The Daycare was her only asset, and its collapse would have meant her total ruin. Faced with the choice between responsibility and self-interest, she chose an act of unimaginable evil. Her brother, motivated by a twisted sense of family loyalty and a desire to avoid scandal, became her accomplice in mass murder. The handyman, a low-wage worker with a family of his own, was threatened into silence, told that he would be implicated if he ever spoke a word. He lived for 33 years as a prisoner of that secret, the guilt eating him alive. For the families, the truth was a new and terrible kind of pain. The slim, irrational hope that their children might still be out there somewhere alive was brutally extinguished. In its place was the horrifying knowledge that their children had died in terror and darkness, just feet from where they were supposed to be safe, buried by the very woman they had entrusted with their care. The process of identifying the remains began, using advanced DNA technology to match the tiny bones to the aging parents. Each confirmed match was a fresh wave of grief, a final, gut-wrenching end to a lifetime of uncertainty. The news reports detailed the conspiracy minute by agonizing minute, from the collapse of the floor to the hum of the concrete mixer in the dead of night, a sound that had been masked by the rising wind of the storm. The resolution of the legal case was swift, but the human story returned to the forefront. The narrative zoomed back in on Sarah and David Hayes, now in their late 60s, their faces etched with a lifetime of sorrow. The scene of two detectives arriving at their door was one they had both dreaded and prayed for over 3 decades. They sat on the same couch where they had once read bedtime stories to Leo, as the officers gently confirmed that their son's remains had been identified. The news brought no peace, only a different, sharper kind of agony. The relief of knowing was inextricably tangled with the horror of how he died. There was a quiet dignity in their grief, a profound exhaustion. David went into the backyard and finally, after 33 years, took down the rotting frame of the unfinished treehouse. It was the end of a long, painful chapter. A community memorial service was held for all 15 children. The surviving parents, many seeing each other for the first time in years, gathered not in desperate hope, but in shared, confirmed mourning. They read the names of their children aloud: Leo, Maya, Lily, and 12 others. It was a final goodbye, decades late. The service was a moment of profound catharsis for the town of Meadow Creek. The ghost that had haunted its streets for so long was finally named, and the community could begin to heal, bound together by a tragedy that was no longer a mystery, but a shared, terrible history. For Sarah and David, the future remained an empty space where a life should have been, but the torture of the unknown was over. They had their answer. They could finally, truly mourn their little boy. The case of the Little Sprouts Daycare became a chilling lesson in the depths of human depravity. It wasn't a monster from a fairy tale who committed this crime, but an ordinary woman, a neighbor, a caretaker, driven by the common sins of greed and fear. Her story serves as a terrifying reminder that the most monstrous acts are often committed not for grand, ideological reasons, but to cover up far more mundane failings. The tragedy prompted immediate and sweeping changes in legislation. Leo's Law was passed in Oregon and subsequently adopted by several other states. It mandated rigorous geological surveys and structural integrity inspections for all childcare facilities, ensuring that no building that housed children could harbor such a deadly secret. The case is now a staple in criminology and psychology textbooks, a case study in criminal negligence, the psychology of cover-ups, and the long-term trauma inflicted upon a community by a single, horrific act. The legacy of the 15 children is not just one of tragedy, but of change. Their deaths, and the decades-long lie that concealed them, forced a necessary, painful look at the systems in place to protect the most vulnerable. The story endures as a testament to the enduring power of parental love, a love that never stopped searching for answers, and a somber reflection on the terrible, irreversible cost of a secret buried in concrete and lies. A choice born from cowardice created a wound that festered for over 30 years. It's a story that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight. If this case and the search for its devastating truth struck a chord with you, please consider liking this video and sharing it to help these stories be told. Subscribe for more true crime mysteries that delve into the darkness. We want to know your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what you believe is the most unforgivable part of this cover-up.